Hello everybody, hope you guys are doing well. We start our last topic for Unit 5 today, monopsony. There's no reason that I have a picture of me and my kids scuba diving, but I always like to start my videos with a picture, and so here you go. We were at, I think this was Key Largo, where we were at this time. But anyway, let's get started. So monopsony, we've already talked about monopoly. And so monopoly was when we had one seller in the market, right? Well, monopsony is when you have one buyer in the market. And so the way College Board addresses monopsony is in just a very specific situation. And so it's one buyer, but really it's just one firm hiring people rather than having multiple firms that are hiring. And so far, we've only talked about our labor market being perfectly competitive. Here we have a picture of a perfectly competitive firm, right? Which it's been quite a while since we've looked at this graph, but I'm sure you guys all remember that this graph was distinctive because it had this horizontal demand line, right? Our Mr. Dart that was always flat. And this told us a couple of things, but one of the big things was that these firms were all price takers, right? They had no ability to control price. They just had to take whatever the going rate was. Now, they could sell as many bushels of wheat as they wanted to at that price, but they could not influence price. And so when we have a perfectly competitive labor market, it's a little bit different. It's a really similar idea, but it ends up looking different. In this case, it is our supply of labor that is horizontal, and our demand is downward sloping. But what this means is that the demand, that represents companies that want to hire people, they can hire as many people as they want to at this wage rate, right? There's an infinite supply of people at, whatever, $15 an hour. So that's all we've talked about so far is examples where labor was a perfectly competitive market. So now let's talk about when it is imperfectly competitive. And so for us, that means that we are going to have a monopsony. Now, if you'll recall, with the perfectly competitive firm, that Mr. DARP, what that meant was that my marginal revenue and my demand were the exact same line. And so just like I'm comparing a perfectly competitive firm and a perfectly competitive labor, I want to do the same with a monopoly and a monopsony. So with a monopoly, you'll recall that we had our demand curve, but then we had this marginal revenue curve that now was separate from demand and it lied below demand. Do you remember why marginal revenue had to be below demand? The reason marginal revenue was below demand was because this was a single price monopolist, right? This monopolist is charging everybody the same price. And if they want to increase the quantity that they are selling, then they have to lower the price. And they have to lower it to everybody. So the marginal revenue of selling one more good has to be less than the current price. Price always comes from demand. So marginal revenue always has to be less than demand, and that's why we get this separate marginal revenue curve. So the same thing happens for a monopsonist. For a monopsonist, their problem is that if they want to hire another human being, since they're the only people, they're the only firm that's hiring people, if they want to hire another person, they've already hired everybody that they can hire at $15 an hour. If they want to hire one more person, they're going to have to pay more than $15 an hour. And they don't get to just pay it to the extra person. They have to raise the pay to everybody. And so just like we have a separate demand and marginal revenue curve, we have a separate supply and marginal factor cost curve. That marginal factor cost is telling me that if I want to hire one more person, I'm going to have to pay more and pay more to everybody. Going back to our monopolist, I have drawn in my average total cost curve and my marginal cost curve. Now, remember, marginal cost is the supply curve for the firm, right? And if we want to identify our profit maximizing price and quantity for our monopolist, what we always did was, of course, look at where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect and go up to demand to find the price for the monopolist and the quantity for the monopolist. Now, remember what we ended up learning when we compared a monopoly to a perfectly competitive firm. What we said was that a monopolist will charge too high of a price and produce too small of a quantity, right? That perfectly competitive firms produce more and at a lower cost to the consumer. So now I've added in a demand curve to our monopsonist. And just like with the monopoly, we did marginal revenue equal marginal cost, and remember my marginal cost was supply. Here, we're going to do demand and where that intersects marginal cost. So to determine how many people get hired and at what rate, I look at the intersection of demand and the marginal factor cost curve. This marginal factor cost curve, I just want to be clear, it's always going to lie above your supply. Just like for the monopolist, marginal revenue lies below demand. Marginal factor cost lies above supply. So, I look for this intersection, create my vertical line. That quantity right there, that is the quantity, I'll call Q1, that's how many people get hired. To figure out the wage rate that these people are going to get paid, I look at where this vertical line intersects supply, right? With the monopolist, we always looked at demand. With the monopsonist, we look at supply. I'll call that W1, that's the wage rate. So this is how a monopsonist is going to choose how many people to hire and at what wage rate they will get paid. Had this been a perfectly competitive firm or industry, this wouldn't be a firm, it would be an industry, we would look at where supply and demand intersect. So in a perfectly competitive industry, Q2 would be the quantity of people hired at a wage rate of W2. But with a monopsonist, since they have to increase pay every time they want to hire another person, they have this separate marginal factor cost curve. They would hire fewer people, Q1, and pay them a lower wage rate, W1. Okay, so I've created some a small assignment on my AP that's got some multiple choice questions about monopsonies. So go ahead and get on there, get those done, and get those turned in. Hope you guys have a great weekend.